October 30th, 2025, Gimhae Air Base, Busan, South Korea. Two men walk into a room that, for the next 2 hours, will hold the economic fate of billions. The tension is electric. One man has just threatened to impose 100% tariffs. The other controls 70% of the world's most critical minerals and holds leverage over industries from smartphones to fighter jets. When they emerge, one will rate the meeting a 12 on a scale of 10. The other will have secured something far more valuable than a number. This isn't just another diplomatic handshake. This is the story of how the world's two superpowers sat down to negotiate the future and why the answer to who won might surprise you more than you think. Let's rewind. When Donald Trump walked back into the White House on January 20th, 2025, he had a plan. Actually, he had many plans, but one dominated everything else: remake America's relationship with China. The campaign promises had been bold, aggressive, even shocking. 100% tariffs, reciprocal trade deals, manufacturing jobs flooding back to American soil, the end of Chinese dominance in critical technologies. It was an ambitious agenda that would require not just tough talk, but tougher negotiations with the one nation that could actually push back. And push back they did. Within weeks of Trump's inauguration, the trade war that many thought had cooled during the Biden years roared back to life with a ferocity that made the first Trump administration look tame. On February 1st, 2025, Trump signed 3 executive orders imposing 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico and 10% tariffs on China, citing concerns about fentanyl trafficking. The justification was national security. The real message was clear. America was no longer playing by the old rules. China's response came swift and calculated. Beijing didn't just slap retaliatory tariffs on American goods. They went for the jugular. In April 2025, China announced new licensing requirements for rare earth exports to all countries. Not just the United States, all countries. It was a move that sent shockwaves through boardrooms from Silicon Valley to Stuttgart. Rare earths, those 17 obscure elements on the periodic table that most people had never heard of, suddenly became the most talked about materials on the planet. Why? Because modern life runs on them. Every smartphone, every electric vehicle, every wind turbine, every precision-guided missile relies on these minerals, and China produces 70% of the global supply. The implications were staggering. Without rare earths, American defense contractors couldn't build advanced weapon systems. Tesla couldn't manufacture electric vehicles at scale. Apple couldn't produce iPhones. The entire green energy transition that both political parties had championed would grind to a halt. China had just shown the world that in the game of economic chicken, they weren't driving a sedan. They were driving a tank. But Trump wasn't backing down either. By March 2025, he had raised the Chinese tariffs from 10% to 20%. The stock markets trembled. Economists warned of recession. American farmers, already struggling from years of trade uncertainty, watched nervously as China suspended purchases of their soybeans. The agricultural boycott wasn't just economics, it was politics. Soybeans are grown primarily in Republican voting states. China knew exactly where to apply pressure to make Trump's political base uncomfortable. The escalation continued through spring and summer. Trump imposed 50% tariffs on steel, aluminum, and copper. China responded with export controls not just on rare earths, but on antimony and tungsten, critical materials for military applications. American companies scrambled to find alternative suppliers. There weren't any, not at scale, not at price points that made sense. The global supply chain that had been built over decades couldn't be restructured in months. By late September, the situation had reached a critical point. The Tax Foundation calculated that Trump's tariffs would cost the average American household $1,000 in 2025 and $1,300 in 2026. Consumer prices were rising. Inflation, which had finally begun to cool, started ticking upward again. Bond markets flashed warning signs. The Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell, whom Trump had repeatedly pressured to cut interest rates, held firm, citing the inflationary pressure from tariffs. Trump hinted he might try to fire Powell. Markets plunged. Trump backed off. The incident revealed something crucial. For all his bluster, Trump was constrained by economic reality in ways that Xi Jinping simply wasn't. And then came the invitation. Xi Jinping, speaking through diplomatic channels, suggested a face-to-face meeting, not in Beijing, not in Washington, neutral ground, South Korea during the APEC summit. Trump, never one to turn down a deal-making opportunity, agreed. The stage was set for the October 30th meeting that would reshape the trajectory of the world's most important bilateral relationship. Here's what made this meeting different from the countless diplomatic encounters that had come before it. Both leaders understood they were negotiating from positions of mutual vulnerability. Trump needed a deal. The midterm elections were approaching, and his own Republican senators had voted against his tariffs. American businesses were hemorrhaging. Farmers were furious. The stock market volatility was making his wealthy donors nervous. He needed to show progress, to demonstrate that his tough stance had yielded results. Xi needed something different but equally urgent. China's economy, for all its size and strength, was struggling with its own problems. The property market crisis that had started with Evergrande's collapse continued to drag on growth. Youth unemployment remained stubbornly high. Domestic consumption was weak. And while China had successfully diversified its export markets, recording a record $1 trillion trade surplus by year's end, the United States remained its largest single-country market. Losing that completely would hurt. So when Trump and Xi sat down in that room in Busousan, accompanied by their top trade advisors, both men knew they needed to walk away with something. The question was, what would they trade, and what would they keep? The details of the agreement that emerged were carefully crafted to give both sides something to celebrate. China agreed to suspend its rare earth licensing measures for at least 1 year. This was huge. It meant American industries could breathe again, defense contractors could fulfill their orders, tech companies could continue production. The suspension was framed as temporary, a 1-year pause, which allowed Xi to maintain that this was a gesture of goodwill, not a permanent concession. But everyone understood that, once suspended, these controls would be very difficult to reimpose without triggering another crisis. China also committed to purchasing 25 million metric tons of American soybeans annually from 2026 through 2028. This was music to Trump's ears. Farm state senators who had been wavering on their support for his tariff strategy could now point to concrete benefits. The soybean deal wasn't just about agriculture. It was about political survival in the heartland. The fentanyl agreement was another key component. China agreed to halt shipments of fentanyl precursors to North America and suspend retaliatory tariffs that had been announced since March 2025. This allowed Trump to claim a victory on an issue that resonated with voters across the political spectrum. The opioid crisis had devastated American communities. Being able to say he had gotten China to crack down on fentanyl production gave him a powerful talking point. In exchange, Trump lowered the fentanyl-related tariffs from 20% to 10% and suspended the threat of imposing even higher reciprocal tariffs for 1 year. He also scrapped his threat to raise tariffs to 100%, which had been hanging over the negotiations like a sword of Damocles. The overall tariff rate on Chinese goods came down to levels similar to other Asian trading partners. Not back to the pre-trade war levels of around 3%, but manageable, tradable, survivable. But here's where the story gets really interesting. Because when you look past the press releases and the carefully staged photo opportunities, when you examine what actually happened in that room and in the months since, the picture of who won becomes far more complicated than either side wants to admit. Let's start with the most visible scorecard. Trump walked away saying he had achieved a 12 out of 10 meeting. He pointed to the soybean purchases, the fentanyl agreement, the suspension of rare earth controls. He told reporters on Air Force One that the relationship between him and Xi was very, very important, and that they had made tremendous progress. His Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent echoed this narrative, noting that the sky-high tariffs had become the equivalent of an embargo that neither side wanted. But talk to the experts, the people who study U.S.-China relations for a living, and you hear a very different assessment. The Atlantic Council's Melanie Hart noted that the real story was forward-looking, and it was a major win for Beijing. China's biggest concern with Trump wasn't the tariffs themselves, it was his unpredictability. By locking in an extraordinary lineup of pre-scheduled meetings for 2026, including Trump's planned visit to Beijing in April and Xi's potential attendance at the G20 summit in December, China had effectively boxed Trump in. They had forced a degree of predictability, of planability, into a relationship that had been characterized by chaos. Here's what that means in practice. Trump's April visit to Beijing gives China the opportunity to script the next interaction. In the months leading up to that visit, Beijing can press for new concessions, knowing that Trump will want the meeting to go well, to look successful. A Boeing deal covering up to 500 aircraft is already being discussed as a centerpiece of the April summit. If that deal happens, it would be one of the largest commercial agreements in aviation history, and it would give Trump another win to tout. But it would also mean that China has successfully turned Trump's need for visible victories into a negotiating lever. The rare earth situation tells an even more revealing story. When Chinese officials announced those export controls in April 2025, Western observers initially dismissed it as an overreach. Surely, they reasoned, cutting off rare earths would hurt China as much as it hurt the West. Chinese companies would lose revenue. Chinese workers would lose jobs. It was mutually assured economic destruction. Except it wasn't, because China had spent years preparing for exactly this scenario. They had built up massive stockpiles. They had developed downstream industries that added value to raw, rare earth materials before export. They had created a vertically integrated supply chain that gave them cushion against disruption. When the export controls hit, Chinese rare earth companies barely felt it. But American and European companies panicked. The leverage was entirely one-sided. Now consider what China got in exchange for suspending these controls for 1 year. They got Trump to lower tariffs. They got him to abandon the threat of 100% tariffs. They got him to commit to a state visit where more concessions could be extracted. And they maintained the option to reimpose the controls at any time if the relationship soured. Over two-thirds of experts surveyed by the Center for Strategic and International Studies assessed that China had played its hand well with the rare earth restrictions. Only 23% said China had overplayed its hand. The soybean purchases, which Trump trumpeted as a major victory, also deserve closer scrutiny. Yes, China committed to buying 25 million metric tons annually for 3 years. But remember, this is the same China that committed to buying $200 billion of American goods and services in the Phase 1 trade deal signed during Trump's first term. How much did they actually buy? 58% of what they promised. China has a long history of making purchase commitments in trade negotiations and then finding reasons not to fulfill them. Weather problems, quality concerns, market conditions. There's always an excuse. Even if China does follow through this time, consider what they're getting in return. Agricultural commodities are fungible. China needs to import soybeans, regardless of the political relationship with the United States. They were buying from Brazil and Argentina during the boycott. Now they're agreeing to shift some of those purchases back to American farmers. This costs China very little in real terms. They're buying soybeans either way. But it gives Trump political cover with farm state voters and allows him to claim he's standing up for American agriculture. Meanwhile, the underlying structural issues in the U.S.-China relationship, the things that actually matter for long-term competition, remain unresolved. China continues to subsidize its strategic industries at massive scale. The state-directed investment in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, advanced semiconductors, and clean energy technology continues unabated. In fact, it's accelerating. China's 15th five-year plan, which runs from 2026 to 2030, explicitly designates technology self-sufficiency as a national priority. They're not trying to compete with the United States in these sectors. They're trying to leapfrog us, and they're making progress. In artificial intelligence, Chinese companies are now producing models that rival American ones. DeepSeek's recent large language model shocked Silicon Valley with its capabilities and low cost. Chinese researchers are publishing more AI papers than their American counterparts. In quantum computing, China has demonstrated capabilities that some Western experts didn't think were possible. In electric vehicles and battery technology, Chinese companies aren't just catching up. In many categories, they're ahead. Here's the uncomfortable truth that neither Trump nor Xi wants to fully acknowledge. The negotiation in Busousan wasn't really about tariffs or soybeans or even rare earths. It was about buying time. Trump needed time to make it through the midterms without his own party revolting over the economic pain his tariff strategy was causing. Xi needed time to continue building China's technological independence and to navigate domestic economic challenges without a complete rupture with the West. The one-year time frame for most of these agreements is revealing. Nothing is permanent. Nothing is structural. Everything can be renegotiated, reimposed, or revised when the calendar flips. Both sides are essentially betting that time works in their favor. Trump is betting that he can use this breathing room to secure more favorable long-term deals, that he can leverage the threat of renewed tariffs to extract bigger concessions down the road. Xi is betting that time allows China to reduce its vulnerabilities, to build out domestic alternatives to American technology, to deepen relationships with Europe and Southeast Asia that dilute American leverage. So who's right? Whose bet is more likely to pay off? The honest answer is that it's too early to know. But there are some clues in what's happened since the Busousan meeting that suggest the dynamics may be tilting in China's direction. Consider the response of America's allies. When Trump launched his global tariff offensive in early 2025, he assumed that most countries would quickly seek bilateral deals on American terms, and some did. Britain signed an agreement. Japan came to the table. South Korea negotiated a deal, though Trump has since accused them of not honoring it. But the biggest trade developments of 2026 haven't involved the United States at all. The European Union and India signed what EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen called the mother of all deals, creating a free trade zone of 2 billion people. China and Canada inked a limited agreement on electric vehicles and canola oil. These partnerships aren't meant to replace trade with the United States. But they signal a world that's hedging its bets, that's no longer comfortable being entirely dependent on the American market or American leadership. The Taiwan question looms over everything. Trump's 2026 national defense strategy conspicuously omitted any specific commitments to Taiwan's defense. Previous versions of that document had explicitly noted China's provocative actions around Taiwan. This one said nothing. The omission was deliberate, designed to preserve diplomatic flexibility, but it also sent a signal. Throughout 2025, There were reports of the Trump administration canceling meetings with Taiwanese defense officials, denying transit visas to Taiwanese leaders, and initially rejecting a $400 million military aid package for Taiwan. These actions raised uncomfortable questions among America's Asian allies. Was Taiwan becoming a bargaining chip? Trump and his advisors insist that's not the case. They point to a record-breaking arms sale to Taiwan that was approved later in the year. They argue that the National Defense Strategy's silence on Taiwan is strategic ambiguity, a deliberate choice to keep Beijing guessing about America's response to aggression. But allies aren't convinced. When you're facing the possibility of Chinese military action, ambiguity isn't reassuring, it's terrifying. Meanwhile, China has been conducting increasingly aggressive military exercises around Taiwan. The massive drill in late December 2025 was the largest yet. Beijing is testing American resolve, probing for weaknesses, demonstrating capabilities. Every time Trump meets with Xi and walks away without forcefully addressing Taiwan, Beijing's calculation shifts slightly. Maybe, just maybe, Trump really would trade Taiwan commitments for trade concessions. Maybe America's security guarantee, the foundation of Asian stability for 70 years, really is negotiable. The economic scoreboard tells its own story. Despite all of Trump's tariffs and trade restrictions, China delivered a record $1 trillion trade surplus in 2025. How? By diversifying markets, by moving up the value chain, by becoming indispensable in too many supply chains to be easily replaced. When you control the production of critical minerals, when you dominate solar panel manufacturing, when you're the world's factory for everything from antibiotics to phone chargers, you have options. You have resilience, you have leverage. American manufacturing has seen some bright spots. There have been announcements of new investments, new factories, new jobs. Trump's White House maintains a running tally of these commitments on its website, touting them as evidence of the Trump effect. But experts urge caution. Many of these announcements are non-binding memorandums of understanding, not actual capital expenditures. Many combine future projections with existing investment plans. And many come with caveats about permitting timelines, environmental reviews, and workforce availability that could delay or derail actual construction for years. The rare earth processing facility that Linus Rare Earths is building in Texas, developed with Department of Defense support, has faced permitting delays related to wastewater disposal. In Malaysia, rare earth operations were suspended in late 2025, following reports of river contamination and radiation levels that significantly exceeded safety thresholds. Building a rare earth supply chain isn't just about money. It's about environmental regulations, community acceptance, technical expertise, and time. Lots of time. China spent decades building its dominance in this sector. The United States can't replicate that in a few years, no matter how much political will exists. The infrastructure challenge is even more daunting. China has been building power generation capacity at a pace that exceeds the rest of the world combined. Their data centers pay less than half the electricity costs of American data centers. When artificial intelligence requires massive computing power, when training large language models costs millions of dollars in electricity alone, that cost advantage matters. China's centralized system can mandate infrastructure build-out. America's decentralized approach relies on private investment, utility negotiations, and local regulatory approval. One is fast, the other is democratic. Which one wins in a technology race? All of this brings us back to the central question. Was the Busousan Agreement Trump's masterstroke? Was it evidence that America's willingness to negotiate with its biggest rival from a position of strength could yield concrete results? Or was it something else entirely? Here's one way to think about it. Trump achieved tactical victories. He got the soybean purchases that will help in farm states. He got the fentanyl agreement that plays well politically. He got China to suspend rare earth controls, which prevents an immediate economic crisis. These aren't nothing. They're real concessions that provide real benefits. In the short term, Trump can point to these wins and argue that his approach is working. But Xi achieved something more fundamental. He forced Trump into a structured dialogue. He demonstrated that China has economic weapons that can inflict real pain on American industries. He showed American allies that Beijing can be a partner as well as a competitor, signing deals with Europe and others while negotiating with Washington. He bought time to continue building China's technological capabilities, while the United States remains distracted by trade disputes. And he maintained flexibility. The one-year time frame for most agreements means that China can reassess and adjust as conditions change. Perhaps, most importantly, Xi revealed the limits of Trump's leverage. Yes, America can impose tariffs. Yes, America still has the world's largest economy and most powerful military. But that doesn't translate into unlimited negotiating power anymore. The world is more multipolar than it was a decade ago. Supply chains are more complex, technology is more distributed, and China is more resilient and resourceful than Washington sometimes wants to acknowledge. The February 5th, 2026 phone call between Trump and Xi added another layer to this story. Trump described it as a long and thorough call and characterized his relationship with Xi as extremely good. They discussed Iran, Russia's war in Ukraine, and China's energy purchases. But Xi also used that call to reassert that Taiwan is the most important issue in bilateral relations. Translation: don't think that trade concessions mean we're compromising on Taiwan. That's non-negotiable. And that gets to the heart of why this question of who won the negotiation is so complicated. Both leaders are playing different games. Trump is playing a transactional game, seeking deals that he can tout to voters and that provide economic benefits to key constituencies. That's not a criticism, it's his governing philosophy. Make deals, get wins, move on to the next deal. Xi is playing a longer, more strategic game. He's thinking about China's position not just in 2026 or 2028, but in 2035 and 2050. He's thinking about technological dominance, about regional hegemony, about China's place in history. For Xi, this isn't just about trade deficits or soybean purchases. It's about whether China can become the world's leading power, whether it can reshape the international order to reflect Chinese interests and Chinese values. From that perspective, the Busousan Agreement isn't an endpoint, it's a checkpoint. It's a temporary arrangement that allows both sides to catch their breath before the next round. And the next round is coming. Trump's April visit to Beijing will bring new negotiations, new pressure points, new opportunities for both sides to seek advantage. The potential G20 meeting in December offers another forum. And beyond that, whoever wins the American presidential election in November will inherit this relationship and all its complexities. Here's what we know for certain. The United States and China are locked in a competition that will define the 21st century. It's a competition across multiple domains: economic, technological, military, ideological. The Busousan Agreement didn't resolve that competition. It didn't even really change its trajectory. What it did was establish some temporary rules of the road, some guardrails to prevent the competition from spiraling into something far more dangerous. Was that Trump's masterstroke? Maybe. Managing great power competition without triggering great power conflict is no small achievement. If the Busousan Agreement and its follow-on negotiations can keep the U.S.-China relationship in a zone of managed competition rather than outright hostility, that's valuable. That's worth something. But calling it a masterstroke implies a level of strategic clarity and forward planning that doesn't quite match the chaotic, improvisational nature of how Trump conducts foreign policy. The tariff escalation wasn't carefully calibrated to extract maximum concessions at minimum cost. It was a messy, volatile process that spooked markets, alienated allies, and forced Trump himself to backtrack multiple times when economic pressure became too intense. The fact that it eventually led to a negotiated agreement doesn't mean it was masterfully planned from the start. And here's the really uncomfortable truth that should keep American policymakers up at night. China learned from this experience. They learned that Trump's threats often don't materialize. They learned that he values the appearance of deals more than the substance of structural change. They learned that economic pain can force him to compromise. They learned that his own political vulnerabilities, the bond market reactions, the Senate votes, the farm state pressure, can be exploited. Next time there's a crisis, next time tensions rise, China will remember all of this. They'll know exactly how to push Trump's buttons, how to apply pressure, when to offer face-saving compromises. The experts who study this relationship are deeply divided about what comes next. About a third of them think the U.S.-China relationship will become more antagonistic in 2026. Another third predict it will become more cooperative. The final third expect muddle, more of the same managed competition with ups and downs, but no clear trajectory. The fact that experts can't agree tells you something important. This relationship is genuinely uncertain, genuinely consequential, and genuinely impossible to predict with confidence. What we can say is this: the Busousan meeting was a significant moment, but it wasn't a turning point. It didn't fundamentally alter the dynamics of U.S.-China competition. It provided temporary relief from escalating trade tensions, but it didn't resolve the underlying issues that drive those tensions. It gave both leaders political wins they could tout domestically, but it didn't create a framework for long-term stability. So when we ask whether Trump's willingness to negotiate with America's biggest rival was a masterstroke, the answer depends on what we're measuring. If we're measuring the ability to step back from the brink of economic warfare, to find a temporary modus vivendi that allows trade to continue and both economies to function, then yes, it was successful. Both sides showed flexibility, both sides made concessions, both sides avoided the worst-case scenario of a complete rupture. But if we're measuring whether Trump fundamentally changed the balance of power in America's favor, whether he forced China to abandon its ambitions, whether he secured American technological and economic dominance for the next generation, then no, this wasn't a masterstroke. It was a temporary pause in a marathon competition that China is increasingly well-positioned to win. The United States still has tremendous advantages. The dollar remains the world's reserve currency. American universities still attract the world's best talent. Silicon Valley still drives innovation at a pace China struggles to match. The U.S. military remains the most powerful on Earth. These advantages are real and significant, but they're not infinite, and they're not unassailable. China is patient, China is focused, and China is playing the long game while America argues about the next election cycle. In the end, maybe the most honest answer to our question is this. The Busousan Agreement wasn't a masterstroke by either side. It was a mutual recognition that both countries need each other, that complete decoupling would be catastrophically expensive for both economies, and that managed competition is preferable to outright conflict. That's not exciting. It doesn't make for dramatic headlines, but it might be the most important outcome of all. Because the alternative, a world where the United States and China can't find ways to coexist and compete peacefully, is too frightening to contemplate. We're talking about the two largest economies on Earth, two nuclear powers, two permanent members of the UN Security Council. If they can't figure out how to manage their rivalry, if every trade dispute escalates into an economic war, if every diplomatic slight triggers a cycle of retaliation, then we're all in trouble. Not just Americans and Chinese, but everyone who depends on stable global trade, everyone who relies on international cooperation to address climate change and pandemics and nuclear proliferation. After months of escalation, after threats of 100% tariffs, after export controls and agricultural boycotts and rare earth restrictions, the fact that these two leaders could sit in a room for 2 hours and find areas of agreement is not nothing. It's not a masterstroke, but it's not nothing. The question now is what happens next? Will Trump's April visit to Beijing build on the Busousan Agreement, creating momentum toward a more stable relationship? Or will it become just another photo opportunity, another round of temporary deals that don't address fundamental issues? Will China use the breathing room to accelerate its push for technological independence, making itself less vulnerable to American pressure? Will Trump use the political capital from the soybean deal to push for more structural reforms in the Chinese economy? We don't know yet. We won't know for years. This is the frustrating reality of great power competition in the 21st century. There are no clear victories, no decisive moments, no master strokes that permanently tip the balance. There's only the grinding, difficult work of managing a complex relationship between two nations that are simultaneously competitors, trading partners, and potential adversaries. But let's dig deeper into what's really at stake here, because the surface-level narrative of tariffs and trade deals misses the bigger picture. What's happening between the United States and China isn't just about economics. It's about two fundamentally different visions of how the world should work, two competing models of governance and development. The United States has long championed free markets, competition-driven innovation, and transparent regulatory frameworks. China operates under a very different model where the state plays a role that would be unthinkable in the United States. Strategic industries receive massive subsidies. State-owned banks provide below-market loans to favored companies. Foreign companies face requirements to share technology and accept government oversight that goes far beyond Western norms. For decades, Western observers assumed that as China got richer, as its middle class grew, as its companies went global, it would gradually adopt more Western-style market reforms. The logic seemed irresistible. Prosperity creates demands for political freedoms. Middle-class consumers want rule of law, property rights, independent courts. Global companies need transparent regulations and intellectual property protections. China would have to liberalize, or it would stagnate. Except that hasn't happened. If anything, under Xi Jinping, China has moved in the opposite direction. The state has tightened control over private companies. Regulatory crackdowns have targeted successful tech entrepreneurs who got too powerful, too independent, too willing to challenge Communist Party priorities. Jack Ma, the founder of Alibaba and once China's richest man, literally disappeared from public view for months after giving a speech that criticized Chinese financial regulators. When he reappeared, he was a chastened man, his business empire broken up, his influence curtailed. The message to other Chinese business leaders was crystal clear. You can get rich in China, but only if you remember who's ultimately in charge. And yet, despite this increased state control, or perhaps because of it, China continues to grow, to innovate, to compete. Its companies are at the forefront of electric vehicles, facial recognition technology, mobile payments, solar panels, and increasingly artificial intelligence. This creates a profound challenge for the Western model. What if the assumption that prosperity requires liberalization is wrong? What if a state-directed authoritarian capitalist system can actually outcompete democratic capitalism in certain domains? That's the existential question underlying the trade negotiations in Busousan and every other interaction between Trump and Xi. It's not really about whether American farmers can sell more soybeans to China. It's about whether the American model of development can prevail against the Chinese model. And right now, the answer isn't as clear as Americans would like it to be. Consider the infrastructure gap. American politicians love to talk about Infrastructure Week, about rebuilding America's crumbling roads and bridges and airports. But talk is cheap. Actual infrastructure investment requires overcoming environmental reviews, community opposition, labor negotiations, budget battles, and a political system that struggles to think past the next election. China doesn't have these constraints. When Chinese leaders decide to build a high-speed rail network, it gets built. When they decide to construct massive solar farms, they appear. When they need new ports to facilitate trade, the ports materialize. This difference shows up in stark numbers. In 2025, China built more high-speed rail than the rest of the world combined. They added more renewable energy capacity than Europe and America together. They launched more satellites. They filed more patent applications. They graduated more engineers. In a race to build the infrastructure of the 21st century, China is sprinting, while America is still debating what shoes to wear. The artificial intelligence competition illustrates this dynamic perfectly. The United States has incredible AI companies. OpenAI's ChatGPT revolutionized how we think about large language models. Google's DeepMind made breakthroughs in protein folding that could accelerate drug discovery. American AI research is still considered the global gold standard, but China is catching up faster than anyone expected. Chinese companies have access to more data than their American counterparts because Chinese privacy laws are far more permissive. Chinese researchers can conduct experiments that would never clear ethical reviews in the West. Chinese AI companies receive government support that dwarfs anything available to American startups. More fundamentally, China is approaching AI as a national priority in ways that America isn't. The Chinese government has declared AI a strategic technology and is coordinating investment, research, and deployment across the economy. American AI development, for all its brilliance, is fragmented across competing companies, universities, and government agencies that don't always work together effectively. One approach is centralized and focused. The other is decentralized and diverse. Which one wins? We're about to find out. The semiconductor battle adds another dimension to this competition. Semiconductors, those tiny chips that power everything from phones to missiles, have become the most contested technology on Earth. The United States pioneered semiconductor manufacturing, and American companies like Intel and Qualcomm remain leaders. But the actual manufacturing has largely moved to Asia, particularly to Taiwan. Semiconductor manufacturing company, TSMC, which produces the most advanced chips in the world. This creates a strategic vulnerability that both Trump and Xi understand. If China were to seize Taiwan, either through military force or through economic coercion, it could potentially control access to the most advanced semiconductors. American defense systems, American smartphones, American data centers would all be at risk. That's why the United States has invested billions in trying to onshore semiconductor manufacturing, offering massive subsidies to companies willing to build fabs in America. But here's the problem. Building a semiconductor fab isn't like building a car factory. It requires incredibly specialized equipment, much of it made by only one company in the world, a Dutch firm called ASML. It requires ultra-pure water, precise climate control, and technical expertise that takes years to develop. Intel is trying to catch up to TSMC's manufacturing capabilities. Samsung is trying. American startups are trying. But TSMC has a decade head start and continues to innovate. Meanwhile, China is pouring resources into developing its own semiconductor industry, trying to break its dependence on Western and Taiwanese chips. Trump's export controls on advanced semiconductors to China, maintained and expanded from the Biden administration, are meant to slow China's progress, and they have had some effect. Chinese companies can't access the most cutting-edge chip-making equipment. Chinese researchers can't train the largest AI models because they lack access to the most powerful processors. But export controls have a downside. They incentivize China to invest even more heavily in developing domestic alternatives. They push Chinese companies to innovate around their restrictions. They accelerate exactly the technological decoupling that makes the competition more dangerous. The rare earth issue connects to all of this. Those 17 elements that most people had never heard of until China threatened to restrict exports, they're essential for manufacturing everything we've been talking about. Semiconductors require rare earths. Electric vehicle motors require rare earths. Wind turbines require rare earths. Advanced weapon systems require rare earths. And China doesn't just mine 70% of the world's rare earths. They process over 90% of them. Mining rare earths is difficult but doable in other countries. Processing them at scale, dealing with the toxic waste, developing the technical expertise, that's where China's real advantage lies. The United States has rare earth deposits. Australia has rare earth deposits. Canada, Greenland, and several African nations have rare earth deposits. But turning those deposits into a functioning supply chain that can compete with China requires years of investment, environmental approvals, technology development, and market development. Companies won't make those investments unless they're confident they can compete with Chinese producers who have economies of scale and government support that American companies can't match. That's why China's agreement to suspend rare earth export controls for 1 year was so significant. It removed the immediate crisis, allowing American industries to keep operating. But it didn't solve the underlying vulnerability. A year from now, China could reimpose those controls if the relationship sours, and American companies would be right back where they started, dependent on a strategic competitor for materials essential to national security. This brings us to a crucial point about the Busousan negotiations that often gets overlooked. Trump and Xi weren't negotiating in a vacuum. They were negotiating in front of an audience of allies and partners who were watching carefully to see what the deal revealed about American priorities and American staying power. And that audience drew some uncomfortable conclusions. European leaders noted that Trump had threatened tariffs on European goods, that he had demanded NATO members increase defense spending, that he had questioned America's commitment to European security. They saw Trump prioritize a deal with China that addressed immediate economic concerns, while leaving larger strategic issues unresolved. The message they received was that American support isn't guaranteed, that American priorities are transactional, that perhaps Europe needs to develop its own relationships with China, rather than relying entirely on the American security umbrella. That's why the European Union moved quickly to negotiate its own trade agreements with India, with Southeast Asian nations, with anyone who could help diversify Europe's economic partnerships. It's not that Europe wants to abandon the transatlantic alliance, but European leaders are hedging their bets, preparing for a world where American leadership can't be taken for granted. Asian allies drew similar lessons. Japan and South Korea, both treaty allies with American troops stationed on their soil, watched Trump's negotiations with China and wondered whether they could really count on American support in a crisis. South Korea's new president, Lee Jae-myung, has already pursued more engagement with China, knowing that Seoul's economic relationship with Beijing is too important to jeopardize based solely on American preferences. Japan, historically one of America's most reliable allies in containing China, has also reached out to Beijing, seeking to stabilize its most important economic relationship. Even Taiwan, the island democracy that sits at the heart of U.S.-China tensions, has had to adjust its expectations. When Trump's national defense strategy omitted any mention of Taiwan, when his administration initially blocked military aid before reversing course, Taiwanese leaders got a clear message. They can't assume American support is automatic. They need to strengthen their own defenses, develop their own capabilities, and prepare for the possibility that, in a crisis, they might be negotiating their own deals with Beijing. This erosion of alliance cohesion is one of China's strategic objectives. Beijing doesn't need to break American alliances. It just needs to create enough doubt, enough uncertainty, enough space for allies to question whether their interests really align with Washington's. If Japan thinks it can't count on America to defend Taiwan, Japan might decide that maintaining economic ties with China is more important than coordinating security policy with Washington. If South Korea worries that American support is conditional on trade concessions, Seoul might make different choices about how aggressively to counter Chinese influence in the region. China's strategy isn't to isolate America, it's to make America isolate itself. Every time Trump threatens tariffs on allies, every time he questions alliance commitments, every time he prioritizes bilateral deals over multilateral cooperation, he does Beijing's work for them. China doesn't need to convince Germany or Japan or South Korea that America is an unreliable partner. Trump is making that argument himself. Now, to be fair, Trump would argue that he's not weakening alliances. He's strengthening them by demanding that allies pay their fair share, by forcing them to stop free-riding on American security guarantees, by creating a more balanced burden-sharing arrangement. There's some merit to this argument. NATO members have increased defense spending under Trump's pressure. Asian allies have made new commitments to host American troops and support American military operations. The question is whether the short-term gains from these pressure tactics outweigh the long-term costs in alliance cohesion and trust. China is betting that the costs are higher than the benefits. They're betting that Trump's transactional approach to foreign policy creates opportunities for Beijing to offer something different, a partnership that doesn't come with demands for political reform or human rights improvements, a relationship based purely on mutual economic benefit. For many countries, especially in the developing world, that's an attractive proposition. This is where the Belt and Road Initiative comes in. China's massive infrastructure investment program across Asia, Africa, and Latin America isn't just about economics. It's about creating dependency, about building relationships that give China influence, about reshaping the global order to reflect Chinese interests. By financing ports in Sri Lanka, railways in Kenya, power plants in Pakistan, China is creating a network of countries that have economic stakes in Chinese success. Some of these projects have run into trouble. Sri Lanka couldn't pay back its debts and had to lease its main port to Chinese state-owned companies for 99 years. Malaysia renegotiated several Belt and Road projects, arguing that the original terms were too favorable to China. There's been increasing scrutiny of whether Chinese infrastructure loans constitute debt-trap diplomacy, where countries are deliberately lured into unsustainable debt as a way to extract concessions. But even with these problems, the Belt and Road Initiative has made China a major player in development finance, offering an alternative to Western-led institutions like the World Bank and International Monetary Fund. Trump's response to Chinese infrastructure investment has been to criticize it, to warn countries about the dangers of Chinese debt, to argue that deals that seem too good to be true usually are. What Trump hasn't done is offer a compelling alternative. The United States doesn't have trillions of dollars to invest in global infrastructure. American companies operate on commercial terms, looking for profitable investments, not geopolitical influence. The result is that many developing countries have a choice between Chinese financing with strings attached or no financing at all. It's not a hard choice. The technology dimension of this competition is only going to intensify. China is now investing more in research and development than the United States. Chinese universities are producing more STEM graduates. The assumption that America would always lead in innovation is being challenged in real time. Take artificial intelligence and biotechnology. Chinese companies have access to more data than their American counterparts because Chinese privacy laws are far more permissive. Chinese AI companies receive government support that dwarfs anything available to American startups. In biotech, China's regulations allow experiments that would face years of review in the United States. The next breakthrough could come from Shanghai or Shenzhen, not Boston or San Francisco. Or consider quantum computing in the space race. Both are frontiers where the winner will gain enormous strategic advantages. American researchers still lead in quantum, but it's narrowing. China has made breakthroughs in quantum satellite communications that shocked Western experts. In space, China has landed rovers on Mars, built its own space station, and is planning crewed lunar missions while developing capabilities that could disable adversary satellites. The militarization of space and the rapid advancement of AI create risks of miscalculation in a future crisis. All of these technological competitions feed into the military balance. The People's Liberation Army has been modernizing for 2 decades with anti-ship missiles designed to keep American carriers at bay, cyber warfare capabilities, and a Navy that now has more ships than the U.S. Navy. War games suggest America could defend Taiwan, but at enormous cost, consuming stockpiles of precision weapons in days. The Trump administration's approach to this challenge has been to emphasize deterrence through strength, building up American military capabilities in the Pacific, strengthening alliances with Japan, South Korea, Australia, and the Philippines, making clear that any Chinese aggression would be met with overwhelming force. The 2026 National Defense Strategy, despite its deliberate silence on Taiwan, includes substantial resources for the Pacific Deterrence Initiative, for stockpiling munitions, for developing new weapon systems optimized for a Pacific conflict. But deterrence only works if it's credible. If China believes that America doesn't have the will to fight for Taiwan, that Trump might ultimately choose to preserve the economic relationship over defending a distant island, then deterrence fails. That's why Trump's reluctance to clearly state American commitments to Taiwan is so concerning to security experts. Ambiguity can be a useful diplomatic tool, keeping adversaries guessing about American responses. But taken too far, ambiguity becomes weakness. It invites miscalculation. It suggests that America's red lines aren't really red after all. The economic interdependence between the United States and China makes this competition uniquely dangerous. During the Cold War, the United States and Soviet Union had virtually no economic ties. Imposing sanctions, restricting trade, cutting off technology transfer had limited costs for either side. But the United States and China are deeply integrated. American companies rely on Chinese manufacturing. Chinese companies rely on American technology. American consumers depend on Chinese goods. Chinese investors hold over $1 trillion in U.S. Treasury securities. This interdependence creates what economists call mutual vulnerability. Neither side can seriously damage the other without seriously damaging itself. That should be reassuring, a natural break on escalation. But it also creates frustration. When American policymakers want to pressure China on human rights or security issues, they discover that economic tools are double-edged swords. Sanctions that hurt Chinese companies also hurt American companies that depend on them. Export controls that limit Chinese access to technology also limit American companies' largest export market. Trump's tariff strategy was designed to exploit American economic leverage while minimizing American economic pain. The theory was that by threatening massive tariffs, Trump could force China to make concessions without actually having to implement those tariffs and bear the economic cost. Sometimes it worked. The threat of 100% tariffs helped bring China to the table in Busousan, but sometimes it backfired. The bond market reaction when Trump imposed Liberation Day tariffs forced him to backtrack. China will resist. Some deals will be made. Some threats will be withdrawn. The relationship will lurch from crisis to crisis, with periods of relative calm punctuated by escalation. This is exhausting for everyone involved. Markets hate uncertainty. Businesses can't plan long-term investments when trade policy changes every few months. Allies can't coordinate strategy when American policy is constantly shifting. But this is the reality of U.S.-China competition under Trump. It's transactional, unpredictable, focused on short-term wins rather than long-term strategy. Whether this approach ultimately serves American interests better than a more consistent, multilateral, alliance-based strategy is an open question. Trump's supporters would argue that his willingness to take bold action, to break with traditional diplomatic niceties, to use America's economic leverage aggressively, has yielded concrete results that previous administrations' more cautious approaches never achieved. His critics would counter that the short-term tactical gains come at the cost of long-term strategic position, that burning through American credibility and goodwill for temporary trade concessions is a terrible bargain. What's undeniable is that the relationship has changed fundamentally. The idea that the United States and China could be strategic partners, that engagement would lead to convergence, that rising prosperity would make China a responsible stakeholder in the existing international order, all of those assumptions are dead. We're now in an era of strategic competition that will define the 21st century. The only question is whether that competition remains peaceful or whether it escalates into something far more dangerous. The Busousan Agreement was a moment when both sides stepped back from escalation, when cooler heads prevailed, when the economic costs of continued confrontation outweighed the political benefits. That's worth something. That's important, but it's not a solution. It's not even really a strategy. It's a temporary truce in a longer competition whose ultimate outcome remains very much in doubt. And that, perhaps, is the most honest answer to our question. Trump's willingness to negotiate wasn't a masterstroke that tilted the balance decisively in America's favor. It was an acknowledgement that neither side can win this competition through confrontation alone, that both nations need to find ways to coexist while competing, that the alternative to negotiation is too dangerous to contemplate. That's not dramatic. It's not satisfying. But it might be the best we can hope for in an increasingly multipolar, increasingly contested world where the old certainties have disappeared and new rules are still being written through messy, difficult, often disappointing negotiations between leaders who have very different visions of the future but share a world that neither can dominate alone.